The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the marble floor as I watched Catherine Blackwood's perfectly manicured fingers pick up my gift. The hand-carved wooden jewelry box I'd spent 3 weeks perfecting trembled slightly in her grasp. And for a moment, I thought she might actually appreciate the intricate rosewood inlays and the tiny musical mechanism I'd installed inside. Then her lips curved into that practiced smile that never reached her eyes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. How quaint, she said, her voice carrying across the opulent living room of the Blackwood estate like a blade wrapped in silk. David, darling, your girlfriend brought us a little craft project. 24 pairs of eyes turned toward me in that suffocating moment. The Riverside Heights elite, gathered for Catherine's annual charity auction preview, watched with the hungry anticipation of spectators at a gladiator match. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks as Catherine continued her examination of my gift, holding it at arm's length as if it might contaminate her Chanel suit. "Is this from one of those little shops downtown?" she asked, though we both knew she wasn't expecting an answer. "How thoughtful of you to support local artisans." The way she said artisans made it sound like a disease. I could feel David shifting uncomfortably beside me, his jaw clenched as he watched his mother systematically dismantle 3 weeks of my work with nothing more than raised eyebrows and theatrical sighs. "Actually, I made it myself," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. "The wood came from a fallen oak in Forest Park. The mechanism plays Debussy's Clair de Lune." Catherine's laugh tinkled like breaking glass. "Of course you did. How very," she paused, searching for the perfect word to wound, "ambitious of someone in your position." The wooden box made a hollow sound as she set it down on the coffee table, pushing it slightly away from the expensive crystal vase that held her prized orchids. That small gesture, that tiny push, spoke volumes about what she thought of my offering and, by extension, what she thought of me. "David tells me you work with your hands," she continued, and the phrase sounded dirty coming from her lips. "Your mother owns a little bakery, doesn't she? How charming. I suppose crafting runs in the family." The condescension dripped from every syllable. Around the room, her friends exchanged knowing glances, their champagne glasses paused halfway to their lips as they savored this unexpected entertainment. Mrs. Worthington, the pharmaceutical heiress, actually smirked. Mr. Chen, who owned half the commercial real estate in Portland, studied his shoes with barely contained amusement. "Zoe's work is incredible." David finally found his voice, reaching for the jewelry box. "You should see the pieces she's created for." Catherine interrupted, her eyebrows arching higher. "For whom exactly?" "Other little hobby shops, craft fair enthusiasts." She picked up the box again, turning it over in her hands like she was examining a particularly puzzling specimen. "I'm sure it's perfectly adequate for that market." That's when she opened it. The delicate melody of Debussy began to play, the tiny dancers I'd carved spinning in their eternal waltz, and for just a moment, the room fell silent. Even Catherine seemed caught off guard by the haunting beauty of the music combined with the intricate mechanical movements visible through the glass panel I'd installed in the lid. Then she snapped it shut with a sharp click that made me flinch. "Lovely," she said, though her tone suggested anything but. "Though I wonder about the longevity of such homemade mechanisms. Store-bought items tend to be more reliable, don't you think, less likely to break when you actually need them to work." The metaphor wasn't lost on anyone in the room. She wasn't just talking about the music box. David's hand found mine, squeezing gently, but I could see the defeat in his eyes. This was exactly what his mother had planned. Not just to humiliate me, but to demonstrate to everyone present, including her son, that I would never belong in their world of inherited wealth and purchased sophistication. "Of course," Catherine continued, warming to her theme, "I suppose when you can't afford the real thing, you make do with what you can manage." Very resourceful. She gestured vaguely at my dress, a deep blue silk number I'd found at a consignment shop and altered myself. "Though I do hope David explained the dress code. This is a rather formal affair." My dress was perfectly appropriate. More than appropriate, actually. But beside Catherine's custom Valentino gown and her guests' designer ensembles with their original tags still metaphorically attached, I suppose my carefully chosen vintage piece looked exactly like what it was, something bought second-hand and made beautiful through effort rather than expenditure. "I think Zoe looks stunning," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. He was fighting a battle he'd never learned how to win, armed with good intentions against his mother's surgical precision with social cruelty. Oh, absolutely, Catherine agreed with mock enthusiasm. She's very creative with her resources. I'm sure your little business keeps you quite busy, dear. What was it you called it? Heritage something, Heritage Craft Studios. I managed, though my throat felt like sandpaper. Right, how long have you been playing with that? Playing, as if 7 years of building a business from nothing was equivalent to a child's game. As if the calluses on my hands from working with wood and metal were just amusing quirks, rather than evidence of dedication and skill. I watched her friends nod approvingly at her performance. This was exactly the kind of social theater they lived for, the careful dismantling of someone who dared to reach above their designated station. Catherine was providing them with entertainment while simultaneously reinforcing the invisible barriers that kept their world exclusive. Zoe's company has been featured in Portland Monthly 3 times, David said, his voice gaining some heat. She's won awards for her craftsmanship. How nice, Catherine replied, as if he'd mentioned that I'd won a participation trophy at a church bake sale. Local recognition can be so encouraging for small endeavors. She turned back to the jewelry box, lifting the lid once more to let a few notes of Debussy escape before shutting it again with that same sharp finality. Though I do wonder if perhaps your talents might be better suited to more traditional roles, supporting David's career, for instance, rather than pursuing these little hobbies. The room had gone completely quiet now. Even the catering staff seemed to have stopped moving, sensing the tension crackling through the air like electricity before a storm. This was the moment Catherine had been building toward, the kill shot she'd been preparing since the moment David first brought me home. After all, she continued, her smile now razor-sharp, David will need a wife who understands priorities. Someone who can focus on what truly matters rather than being distracted by crafts and creative pursuits. Wife, the word hung in the air like a challenge. Catherine knew exactly what she was doing, forcing the conversation toward territory that would make David squirm, and put me in an impossible position. Answer too enthusiastically, and I'd look desperate. Show any hesitation, and I'd confirm her suspicions that I wasn't serious about her son. Mom, David warned, but Catherine held up one perfectly manicured hand. I'm simply being practical, darling. Your father built Blackwood Hospitality Group into what it is today, because he had a wife who understood her role. Who knew that sometimes we must put aside personal ambitions for the greater good of the family.
Oh,
The greater good of the family. As if marrying David would be some sort of charitable sacrifice on my part, rather than the culmination of 2 years of the most genuine love I'd ever experienced. I looked down at the jewelry box sitting abandoned on the coffee table, its polished surface reflecting the chandelier light like tears. 3 weeks I'd spent on that piece. 3 weeks of careful planning, precise measurements, delicate carving. I'd researched Catherine's taste, studied photos of her home, even learned that Debussy was her favorite composer. Every detail had been chosen specifically to honor her, to show that I took her seriously, that I understood the importance of making a good impression. Instead, she'd turned my gesture of respect into evidence of my inadequacy. I should probably head home, I said quietly, standing on legs that felt like water. Thank you for having me, Mrs. Blackwood. David started to protest, but I was already moving toward the door, leaving the jewelry box on the table like a monument to my foolish optimism. Behind me I could hear Catherine's voice resume its bright social chatter, no doubt explaining to her guests how exhausting it was to deal with David's little infatuation with someone so clearly unsuited to their world. The Portland evening air hit my face like a slap, as I walked to my car, a sensible Honda that looked pitiful next to the parade of luxury vehicles lining the circular driveway. My phone was already buzzing with texts from David, but I couldn't bring myself to read them yet. I needed distance, needed space to process what had just happened and decide how to respond. As I drove through the winding roads of Riverside Heights, past mansions that gleamed like jewels behind their perfectly manicured landscapes, I tried to push down the hurt and humiliation that threatened to overwhelm me. Catherine Blackwood thought she knew me, thought she understood what I was capable of based on my clothes, my car, my mother's bakery, and my small business. What she didn't know was that Heritage Craft Studios was just the tip of the iceberg. What she didn't know was that the little hobby she'd dismissed so easily was actually the public face of something much larger, much more significant than she could possibly imagine. What she didn't know was that her entire family business, the Blackwood Hospitality Group that she wore like a crown, was about to become very, very dependent on someone she'd just treated like a servant. But she was about to learn. The drive back to downtown Portland gave me exactly the time I needed to transform hurt into strategy. By the time I pulled into my reserved parking spot behind the Heritage Craft Studios building, my hands had stopped shaking and my breathing had returned to normal. The familiar sight of my workshop, with its warm lights spilling through the large windows, reminded me of who I really was beneath the humiliation Catherine had tried to wrap around me like a shroud. I climbed the stairs to my private office above the studio, each step helping me shed the powerless feeling that had clung to me since leaving the Blackwood estate. This space, with its exposed brick walls lined with awards, framed magazine covers, and photographs of my pieces in celebrity homes, told a very different story than the one Catherine had written for me tonight. My phone continued its insistent buzzing. David calling, texting, probably pacing around his apartment trying to figure out how to fix what his mother had broken. But there were other notifications too, ones that made my pulse quicken with anticipation rather than anxiety. Stella Kim, my business manager and the only person who knew the full scope of what I'd built.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Had been busy while I was being systematically humiliated at the Blackwood charity preview. Her message was brief but loaded with meaning. Emergency board meeting called for tomorrow morning. They're ready to move forward. Are you? I poured myself a glass of wine from the bottle I kept in my office mini fridge, settling into the leather chair behind my desk to read through the stack of confidential documents Stella had prepared weeks ago. Documents that Catherine Blackwood would never see coming because she'd been too busy looking down on me to look around her. The truth was, Heritage Craft Studios had outgrown its original mission years ago. What had started as my attempt to preserve traditional craftsmanship techniques had evolved into something Catherine's narrow worldview couldn't comprehend. While she saw only a woman playing with wood and metal, I'd been quietly building an empire that touched every aspect of the hospitality industry she thought her family dominated. My custom furniture pieces weren't just in Portland boutiques anymore. They were in five-star hotels from Seattle to San Francisco, in exclusive restaurants whose designers flew me out personally to create signature pieces that defined entire dining experiences. The little craft business, Catherine had dismissed employed 47 people across 3 workshops, with a waiting list of clients that stretched 6 months into the future. But that was still just the public face of what I'd become. The real power lay in Rivera Design Consortium, the holding company I'd established 3 years ago when my individual commissions grew too large to handle through Heritage Craft Studios alone. RDC specialized in complete hospitality environment design, not just furniture, but entire conceptual frameworks for luxury experiences. We didn't just make beautiful objects, we created the settings where wealthy people like Catherine went to feel superior to everyone else. The irony was delicious. Catherine Blackwood had spent the evening condescending to the very person who had designed the ambiance for half the exclusive venues where she held her social gatherings. The custom lighting fixtures in her favorite restaurant, the handcrafted bar in her private club, the signature pieces in the hotel where she hosted her charity luncheons, all of it had been created under my direction, commissioned through layers of contractors and designers who ensured my name never appeared on the final invoices. I'd learned early that real power in the luxury market came from invisibility, from being the secret behind other people's success, rather than seeking the spotlight for myself. Let the front-facing designers take credit for their vision, while I provided the craftsmanship and conceptual foundation that made their visions possible. Let wealthy clients believe they were supporting established design houses, while unknowingly funding the expansion of my influence throughout their world. But tomorrow Catherine Blackwood was going to discover that her dismissal of my little hobby had consequences she never saw coming. My phone rang, interrupting my review of the RDC portfolio. David's name flashed on the screen, and after a moment's hesitation, I answered. Zoe, God, I'm so sorry. His voice was strained, exhausted. What she did tonight was inexcusable. You tried, I agreed quietly. But you also let it happen. Silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of 2 years of similar moments. Not as extreme as tonight perhaps, but countless small instances where David had chosen the path of least resistance rather than standing up to his mother's subtle cruelties. I know, he said finally. I know I should have done more, should have shut her down completely instead of just trying to redirect her. David, this isn't about tonight. I set down my wine glass, choosing my words carefully. This is about a pattern. Your mother has made it clear from day one that she doesn't respect me, doesn't think I belong in your world, and you've spent 2 years hoping she'd eventually come around instead of making it clear that her attitude was unacceptable. She's my mother, Zoe. It's complicated. It's not complicated. The firmness in my own voice surprised me. Either you respect me enough to demand that others do the same, or you don't. There's no middle ground here. Another long pause. When David spoke again, his voice was small, defeated. What are you saying? I'm saying that I need some space to think. About tonight, about us, about whether I want to spend the rest of my life fighting for basic respect from your family. Zoe, please, don't let her win. Don't let her destroy what we have. She's not destroying anything, David. You are by refusing to protect it. I hung up before he could respond, then immediately turned off my phone. There would be time for relationship conversations later, after I'd handled more pressing business. Stella's documents laid out the situation with clinical precision. Blackwood Hospitality Group was in trouble, not obvious, public trouble. Their stock price remained stable, their properties still attracted wealthy clientele, their reputation for luxury experiences remained intact. But beneath the polished surface, they were bleeding money. The hospitality industry had changed dramatically in the past 5 years, but companies like Blackwood had been slow to adapt. Younger travelers wanted authenticity, craftsmanship, unique experiences that felt personal rather than manufactured. They wanted to stay in places that told stories, eat in restaurants that celebrated individual artistry, attend events that felt curated rather than corporate. Catherine's approach to hospitality was rooted in a previous generation's understanding of luxury, expensive materials, recognizable brand names, experiences that impressed through cost rather than creativity. While she'd been focused on maintaining the exclusivity that had built her family's fortune, the market had shifted toward valuing originality and craftsmanship. The very qualities she'd dismissed in me tonight were exactly what the next generation of luxury consumers demanded from their experiences. 3 months ago, Blackwood's board of directors had quietly commissioned a comprehensive analysis of their competitive position. The consulting firm's report, obtained through perfectly legal channels by one of RDC's partner companies, made for fascinating reading. Blackwood was losing market share to smaller, more agile competitors who understood that modern luxury was about storytelling and authenticity, rather than price tags and pedigree. The report specifically recommended that Blackwood pivot toward partnerships with artisan creators, boutique designers, and authentic craft traditions. They needed to transform their properties from generic luxury experiences into unique destinations that offered something their corporate competitors couldn't replicate. They needed, in other words, exactly what Rivera Design Consortium specialized in providing. Stella had spent weeks developing the proposal that would land on the Blackwood board's table tomorrow morning. Not a proposal from Heritage Craft Studios, the little hobby Catherine had dismissed, but from RDC, the design consortium that had quietly become one of the most sought-after hospitality consultants on the West Coast. The proposal was comprehensive, expensive, and exactly what Blackwood needed to remain relevant in a changing market. It offered to redesign their flagship properties from the ground up, creating signature experiences that would differentiate them from every other luxury hospitality group, trying to survive on reputation alone. More importantly, it offered them exclusivity in our services for the Pacific Northwest market, ensuring that their competitors couldn't access the same level of authentic craftsmanship and design innovation that would make Blackwood properties destinations in their own right. The financial terms were generous but not desperate. We were offering them an opportunity, not begging for work. The timeline was aggressive, requiring immediate commitment and substantial upfront investment. The creative control provisions were non-negotiable, giving RDC complete authority over design decisions, without interference from Blackwood management. Catherine would hate every word of it. She would hate the implication that her understanding of luxury was outdated. She would hate surrendering creative control to outside consultants. She would hate the financial investment required to implement changes she fundamentally didn't understand or appreciate. Most of all, she would hate the moment she realized that the woman she'd dismissed as a hobby crafter was actually the key to saving her family's business. I finished my wine and gathered the documents into a neat stack, my mind already shifting into the focused state I'd learned to cultivate before important business decisions. Tomorrow would require precision, strategy, and the kind of ruthless clarity that had built my success from nothing. But tonight, I allowed myself a moment to savor the anticipation. Catherine Blackwood thought she'd seen the last of me, thought her casual cruelty had successfully driven away her son's unsuitable girlfriend. Instead, she'd just guaranteed that our next meeting would happen on very different terms. In the morning, her precious Blackwood hospitality group would discover that their survival depended on someone she'd treated like a servant. The woman she'd dismissed for working with her hands was about to show her exactly what those hands had built while she wasn't paying attention. The phone calls would start early, I knew. Panicked conversations between board members who suddenly realized their family business was more vulnerable than they'd imagined. Desperate attempts to understand how they'd found themselves dependent on a partnership with someone Catherine had personally insulted. And eventually, inevitably, Catherine herself would have to make the call she'd never imagined making, asking for help from the woman whose gift she'd literally pushed away like trash. I smiled as I turned off the office lights and headed home to my downtown loft. Tomorrow was going to be a very interesting day. My phone started ringing at 6:47 in the morning, the shrill sound cutting through the peaceful silence of my downtown loft like a fire alarm. I'd been awake for an hour already, standing on my balcony with a cup of coffee, watching the city wake up below while mentally preparing for what promised to be the most satisfying day of my professional career. The caller ID showed my mother's number, and I almost let it go to voicemail before curiosity got the better of me. Patricia Rivera rarely called before 9, and never on a Wednesday unless something was seriously wrong. Mija, thank God you answered. Her voice was breathless, panicked in a way that made my stomach clench with sudden worry. Is everything okay? Are you hurt? David called here looking for you at 5:30 this morning, said you weren't answering your phone, said something happened at dinner last night with his mother. I closed my eyes, feeling a familiar surge of protective anger. David knew better than to involve my family in his drama, especially my mother, who worked 14-hour days at the bakery and needed her sleep more than she needed to mediate relationship conflicts. I'm fine, Mama. My phone was off. David and I had a disagreement, that's all. A disagreement? Her voice rose an octave. He sounded like someone died. He was crying, Zoe. Actually crying, said his mother did something terrible, and now you won't talk to him. I walked back inside my loft, setting my coffee cup down harder than necessary on the granite countertop. Through my floor-to-ceiling windows, Portland stretched out below me, the Willamette River catching the early morning light like scattered diamonds. This view, this space, this life I'd built for myself, all of it was the result of refusing to accept other people's limitations on what I could achieve. His mother doesn't think I'm good enough for him, I said simply. She made that very clear last night. The sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line told me everything I needed to know about how my mother felt about that assessment. Patricia Rivera had raised 3 children as a single mother while building a bakery from nothing, working 18-hour days and sleeping on flour sacks when she couldn't afford both rent and ingredients. She understood better than anyone what it meant to be dismissed for circumstances beyond your control. What did she say? The dangerous quiet in her voice reminded me where I'd learned to channel anger into focused determination. It doesn't matter what she said, Mama. What matters is that David let her say it. That boy, I could practically hear her shaking her head. I never trusted anyone who wouldn't stand up for the people they claimed to love. Your father had many faults, God rest his soul, but he would have fought anyone who disrespected his family. My father had died when I was 12, leaving behind memories of calloused hands that created beautiful things and a voice that never wavered when defending those he cared about. He would have understood last night in ways David never could, would have recognized the calculated cruelty in Catherine's performance. Mija, you know I love you more than my own life, but you're scaring me. You sound too calm. You sound like you did when the Hendersons tried to shut down the bakery with those false health code violations. The Henderson incident, I'd been 19 then, working part-time at the bakery while taking business classes at Portland Community College. The Hendersons owned the building next door and had decided they wanted to expand their antique shop into our space. When their initial buyout offer was politely declined, they'd somehow managed to trigger a series of surprise health inspections, each one more aggressive than the last. I'd spent 3 weeks documenting every interaction, photographing every inspection, recording every conversation. When I'd finally walked into their lawyer's office with evidence of their bribery attempt and a detailed report of their harassment tactics, they'd withdrawn their expansion plans within 24 hours. My mother had never asked how I'd managed to turn the situation around so completely. She'd just watched me work with that same mixture of pride and concern I could hear in her voice now. "I'm not planning anything dramatic, Mama. I'm just not planning to accept disrespect anymore. That's what worries me." When you get that tone in your voice, buildings start falling down. Before I could respond, my work phone started buzzing with an incoming call. Stella's number flashed on the screen, and I knew without answering that the first domino had just fallen. "I have to go, Mama. Work calls. Kiss abuela for me." "Zoe," her voice stopped me before I could hang up. "Whatever you're planning, remember that revenge is a dish that burns the cook as much as the target." "I'm not looking for revenge," I said, though we both knew that wasn't entirely true. "I'm looking for respect." I switched lines before she could respond, accepting Stella's call with the focused energy that had carried me through every major business decision of the past 7 years. "They took the bait," Stella said without preamble, her voice crackling with excitement. "Emergency board meeting was called for 8 this morning. Our proposal hit their desks at 7, and according to my source in their legal department, 3 board members have already called independent consultants to verify our credentials. And Rivera Design Consortium just became the most impressive hospitality consulting firm they'd never heard of. The legal team spent 2 hours this morning trying to figure out how they missed us during their market research." I allowed myself a small smile as I headed toward my walk-in closet, mentally selecting the outfit that would make the right impression for the day ahead. Power dressing was an art form I'd mastered years ago, understanding intuitively that clothes were a language that spoke before words ever could. What about the financials? That's the beautiful part. Our terms are aggressive but not unreasonable. We're offering them a lifeline, but we're not desperate enough to offer it cheaply. The board members who matter understand that quality costs money, and they're scared enough about their competitive position to consider the investment. I pulled out a charcoal gray suit that had cost more than most people's monthly rent, paired it with a silk blouse the color of deep water, and selected jewelry that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. The total effect would be professional, expensive, and completely removed from the woman Catherine had dismissed as a hobby crafter. Timeline: they want to meet with RDC's principal consultant by end of week. I've already blocked out Friday afternoon for the initial presentation. Full boardroom, complete formality, the works. Perfect. What's their current panic level? Stella laughed, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background. Scale of 1 to 10. About a 15. Apparently, 3 of their major competitors announced expansion plans this week, all focused on the authentic luxury market we specialize in. They're starting to realize they've been fighting yesterday's war. This was better than I'd hoped. Market pressures would make the board more receptive to dramatic changes, more willing to override Catherine's inevitable objections to working with outside consultants. Sometimes the best strategy was simply to arrive at exactly the moment when people were ready to hear what you'd been trying to tell them all along. Any resistance from the family side? That's where it gets interesting. Stella's tone shifted, becoming more careful. Catherine Blackwood wasn't present for the emergency board meeting. Apparently she's in Seattle for some charity event, and won't be back until Thursday. The board made the decision to pursue our proposal without consulting her. I paused in the middle of applying lipstick, processing this unexpected development. Catherine's absence changed the dynamics considerably, but it also meant she would feel ambushed when she returned to discover her board had committed to a partnership she knew nothing about. Does she know about the meeting? Not according to my source. They're treating this as a time-sensitive competitive response rather than a strategic pivot. The kind of decision that gets made first and explained later. And David Blackwood is not a voting member of the board. He holds a ceremonial position as heir apparent, but his mother maintains operational control until she decides to retire, which, according to everyone I've spoken to, is not happening anytime soon. This meant David would be caught in the middle when Catherine discovered what had happened, forced to choose between supporting his mother's authority and acknowledging the business necessity of the board's decision. Given his performance last night, I wasn't optimistic about his ability to navigate that conflict successfully. Anything else I need to know? Just one thing. The board specifically requested that RDC's proposal include a confidentiality clause preventing disclosure of our client relationships to competitors. They're so paranoid about information leaks that they want to ensure complete secrecy around any partnership discussions. I finished my makeup and stepped back to evaluate the complete picture in my full-length mirror. The woman looking back at me bore no resemblance to the one who'd been humiliated at the Blackwood estate 12 hours earlier. This version was polished, powerful, and completely in control of her own narrative. That works in our favor. The longer Catherine remains unaware of who she's actually dealing with, the more committed the board becomes to the partnership. Exactly. By the time she realizes that Rivera Design Consortium is connected to her son's girlfriend, the contracts will be signed, and the financial commitments will be in place. I grabbed my leather portfolio and headed for the door, already mentally shifting into the focused state that had made me successful in an industry that typically dismissed women like me before we ever had a chance to prove ourselves. Set up the Friday meeting. Full presentation, complete portfolio review, the works. And Stella, make sure they understand that RDC doesn't typically work with companies that can't make decisive commitments. We're offering them an exclusive partnership, but exclusivity requires trust. Understood. Want me to hint that we have other opportunities pending? You don't need to hint. We do have other opportunities pending. The Cascade Resort Group has been courting us for 6 months, and the Morrison Hotel chain just doubled their initial offer. Blackwood Hospitality needs us more than we need them, and the board should understand the dynamic from the beginning. I ended the call and headed down to the parking garage, my heels clicking against the concrete in a rhythm that felt like a countdown. By the time I reached my car, my phone was buzzing again with messages from David. Voicemails I had no intention of listening to until this business was concluded. The drive to Heritage Craft Studios gave me time to think through the day's strategy. By now, word of the terminated relationship would be spreading through David's social circle, probably accompanied by Catherine's version of last night's events. She would paint herself as the protective mother, who'd successfully identified and eliminated an unsuitable influence on her son. What she wouldn't know was that her victory celebration was premature. The morning flew by in a series of carefully orchestrated moves, designed to build momentum behind Rivera Design Consortium's emergence as a major player in the hospitality consulting space. Stella worked her network of industry contacts, ensuring that news of our Blackwood proposal reached the right ears in the right way. Not as gossip, but as legitimate business intelligence that positioned RDC as an exclusive firm that other companies should be watching carefully. By lunch, 3 other hospitality groups had reached out requesting preliminary discussions about potential partnerships. By mid-afternoon, a reporter from Hospitality Design magazine was asking questions about our client roster and expansion plans. By evening, Rivera Design Consortium had transformed from Catherine's perspective of a non-entity into an industry presence that demanded attention. The beauty of operating through multiple business entities was that people saw only what you wanted them to see. Heritage Craft Studios remained the visible, accessible face of my work, the company that David knew about and Catherine had dismissed. Rivera Design Consortium existed in the shadows, powerful but deliberately obscure, known only to the people whose opinions actually mattered in the luxury hospitality space. As I locked up the studio that evening, my personal phone finally rang with the call I'd been expecting. Not David this time, but someone whose panic would be far more entertaining. Catherine Blackwood's voice was crisp with barely controlled fury when I answered. "We need to talk." "I'm sorry, who is this?" I asked, though caller ID had already provided the answer. "You know exactly who this is. I just returned from Seattle to discover that my board has committed to a partnership with some consulting firm I've never heard of, apparently in response to a proposal that arrived this morning. A proposal that somehow addressed our internal strategic concerns with suspicious precision." I settled into my car, adjusting the phone against my ear, with the satisfaction of a chess player who just executed a particularly elegant gambit. "I'm not sure how I can help you with your business concerns, Mrs. Blackwood. Don't play games with me. David told me he spoke to your mother this morning, said you were planning something. This consulting firm, Rivera Design Consortium, did you provide with proprietary information about Blackwood Hospitality?" The accusation was both insulting and legally dangerous, the kind of desperate reach that people made when they found themselves losing a game they didn't realize they'd been playing. "Mrs. Blackwood, I'm going to stop you right there before you say something that gets both of us in legal trouble. I have no idea what consulting firm you're referring to, and I certainly don't have access to any proprietary information about your business. If your board made a decision you disagree with, that sounds like an internal matter you should discuss with them. You expect me to believe this is a coincidence? That some mystery consulting firm just happened to propose exactly the kind of partnership our board has been considering, just hours after our dinner conversation. Her voice was rising now, the careful social control she'd displayed last night finally cracking under the pressure of circumstances beyond her command. This was the real Catherine Blackwood, the woman who'd built her power on the ability to control every variable in her environment. I expect you to be very careful about making accusations you can't prove, especially about business matters I have no involvement in. The silence that followed was loaded with frustration and growing suspicion. Catherine was intelligent enough to know that coincidences of this magnitude were rare, but she was also trapped by her own assumptions about what I was capable of achieving. "This isn't over," she said finally. "I certainly hope not," I replied cheerfully. "I'd hate for your business troubles to be resolved too easily." I hung up before she could respond, then immediately called Stella to update her on Catherine's suspicions and ensure our legal position remained unassailable. The next few days would be crucial, requiring careful navigation between advancing our business objectives and avoiding any actions that could be construed as retaliatory or unethical. But as I drove home through the city lights of Portland, I couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was already behind us. Catherine Blackwood had made the fatal mistake of underestimating someone based on surface appearances, and now she was discovering that the world was far more complicated than her privileged perspective had led her to believe. Tomorrow, her board would begin the formal process of evaluating Rivera Design Consortium's proposal. By Friday, they would meet the principal consultant whose vision could save their company from irrelevance. And eventually, inevitably, Catherine would realize that the woman she dismissed as unworthy of her son was actually the key to preserving her family's legacy. The only question remaining was whether she would swallow her pride long enough to accept help from someone she'd treated like garbage, or whether her arrogance would drag her entire business down with her. Either way, it was going to be fascinating to watch. Friday afternoon arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that made Portland look like a postcard, all golden light and clean air that carried the promise of change. I stood in the bathroom of the Summit Conference Center, adjusting my navy suit one final time before walking into what would either be the most satisfying meeting of my career or the most spectacular failure I'd ever engineered. The conference center buzzed with the kind of nervous energy that preceded major business decisions. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the lobby, I could see the Blackwood Hospitality Group's board members arriving in their carefully orchestrated procession of luxury vehicles, each one more expensive than the last. These were people accustomed to being the most important presence in any room, and today they would discover that their survival depended on someone they'd never bothered to notice. Stella appeared beside me, her arms full of presentation materials, and her expression radiating the controlled excitement of a general preparing for a decisive battle. She'd spent the past 3 days transforming our proposal from a business document into a work of art, complete with custom-bound portfolios, architectural renderings, and financial projections that would make even the most skeptical board member take notice. Final headcount, I asked, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from my jacket. 7 voting members, plus Martin Keating as CFO and 2 junior associates taking notes. Catherine landed from Seattle an hour ago, but according to my source, she wasn't invited to this particular meeting. That detail sent a surge of anticipation through me like electricity. Catherine's absence meant the board was already positioning this decision as a business necessity rather than a family discussion, creating the exact dynamic we needed to establish RDC's credibility before personal relationships could complicate the conversation. David, also not invited. Apparently there was some discussion about whether his emotional involvement with the situation would compromise his judgment. I almost laughed at the irony. David's emotional involvement was exactly what had created this opportunity in the first place, but the board would never make that connection until it was far too late to matter. Security concerns. Stella shook her head, gesturing toward the conference center's main entrance where 2 professional-looking men in dark suits flanked the doorway like bookends. Standard executive protection, nothing unusual. They're treating this as a routine partnership evaluation, not a hostile takeover, which was exactly how we wanted them to approach it. The last thing we needed was for anyone to feel ambushed or manipulated before they'd had a chance to see the substance of what we were offering. This had to feel like a business decision they were making freely, even though the circumstances had been carefully orchestrated to ensure they had no real choice. I checked my watch and nodded toward the elevator bank. Time to go change some lives. The conference room was everything I'd expected from a company trying to project old money stability in an increasingly volatile industry. Rich mahogany paneling, oil paintings of stern-looking men in expensive suits, leather chairs that probably cost more than most people's monthly salaries. It was designed to intimidate, to remind everyone present that Blackwood Hospitality Group had been making important decisions in rooms like this for 3 generations. What it actually reminded me of was how desperately they needed someone who understood that the world had moved beyond their grandfather's idea of what impressed people. The board members arranged themselves around the polished conference table with the careful attention to hierarchy that marked old Portland money. Robert Fairchild III sat at the head of the table, his silver hair and weathered face giving him the appearance of someone who'd been making difficult decisions since before I was born. Margaret Chen Williams occupied the seat to his right, her reputation for financial acumen legendary throughout the Pacific Northwest business community. Thomas Morrison held down the left flank, his family's construction empire having built half the luxury developments in the region. These were not people accustomed to being impressed by anyone, especially not by someone young enough to be their daughter. Martin Keating rose when Stella and I entered, his nervous smile betraying the pressure he was under to make this partnership work. As CFO, he understood better than anyone how quickly Blackwood's competitive position was deteriorating, but he also knew that his job depended on navigating the politics of family business dynamics. Board members, I'd like you to meet Zoe Rivera, principal consultant for Rivera Design Consortium. The introductions proceeded with the formal courtesy that marked high-stakes business meetings, each board member offering carefully neutral assessments of my appearance, my credentials, and my potential value to their enterprise. I'd been through this dance dozens of times before, in conference rooms from San Francisco to Vancouver, and I knew exactly how to project the combination of competence and deference that would keep their attention long enough to demonstrate what RDC could accomplish. Miss Rivera. Robert Fairchild's voice carried the authority of someone who'd never had to raise it to command attention. We've reviewed your preliminary proposal, and while it's certainly comprehensive, we have some concerns about timeline and scope. Blackwood Hospitality Group has been serving the luxury market for 67 years. We're not inclined to make dramatic changes without substantial justification. I opened my portfolio and withdrew the first of several presentation boards Stella had prepared, each one designed to address a specific concern, while building toward an inevitable conclusion. Mr. Fairchild, I appreciate your caution, and I share your respect for Blackwood's legacy of excellence. That's exactly why RDC is recommending these changes. Your brand has tremendous value, but that value is being diminished by competitors who understand how luxury market expectations have evolved. I placed the first board on the table, revealing a side-by-side comparison of traditional luxury amenities versus the experiential offerings that were driving current market growth. Custom artwork versus mass-produced elegance. Local artisan partnerships versus generic high-end suppliers. Authentic storytelling versus corporate branding. The clients who can afford to stay at Blackwood Properties aren't just buying a room for the night, they're buying memories, stories they can share, experiences that make them feel connected to something meaningful. Your competitors have figured this out, and they're stealing market share by offering what your current model can't provide. Margaret Chen Williams leaned forward, her sharp eyes focusing on the financial projections embedded in the presentation materials. These revenue increases seem optimistic. You're projecting 30% growth in average daily rates within 18 months. What's your basis for that assumption? Experience with similar transformations. I pulled out a second board showcasing before and after photographs from 3 previous RDC projects, each one demonstrating the dramatic impact of authentic design integration on property performance. The Cascade Mountain Lodge saw ADR increases of 41% following their partnership with RDC. The Harborview Resort in Mendocino achieved 37% growth. The Olympic Peninsula Retreat exceeded 50% within the first year. Thomas Morrison interrupted before I could continue. Those are all smaller properties, boutique operations. Blackwood manages 12 properties across 4 states, with over 2,000 rooms and 6 major event venues. Scale matters. Absolutely it does. I had expected this objection and prepared for it accordingly. But scale also creates opportunity. When you transform the Blackwood brand identity across 12 properties simultaneously, you create a network effect that amplifies the impact at each individual location. Guests who have an extraordinary experience at your Seattle property become ambassadors for your Portland location. Corporate clients who book events at one venue automatically consider your other properties for future needs. I placed the final board on the table, revealing the crown jewel of our proposal, a complete reimagining of the Blackwood guest experience that preserved their reputation for luxury, while adding the authenticity and craftsmanship that modern travelers demanded. This isn't about abandoning what made Blackwood successful, this is about evolving that success to meet current market realities. Every piece we create, every experience we design, every partnership we facilitate will reinforce your brand's core values while extending their appeal to the next generation of luxury consumers. The room fell silent as the board members studied the presentation materials, their expressions shifting from polite skepticism to genuine interest as they processed the implications of what I was proposing. These were experienced business people who understood opportunity when they saw it, even when it came packaged in ways they hadn't expected. Robert Fairchild was the first to speak, his voice thoughtful rather than dismissive. The financial commitment you're requesting is substantial. $15 million over 3 years, with additional performance bonuses tied to revenue targets. That's not the kind of investment we typically make without extensive due diligence. Which is exactly why RDC's proposal includes a 60-day pilot program with your flagship Portland property, Stella interjected smoothly, placing a supplementary document in front of each board member. Full implementation of our design philosophy in your premier location, with measurable performance metrics that will demonstrate ROI before you commit to the broader partnership. Margaret Chen Williams looked up from the financial projections, her expression sharp with calculation. What happens if the pilot program doesn't meet expectations? Then you pay only for work completed and walk away with whatever improvements we've managed to implement. I said simply, RDC doesn't succeed unless our clients succeed. We have no interest in partnerships that don't deliver measurable value. This was the crucial moment where confidence became credibility, where bold promises either transformed into trusted partnerships or collapsed under the weight of their own ambition. I could feel the energy in the room shifting as the board members processed not just what I was offering, but how I was offering it. Thomas Morrison cleared his throat, his expression betraying the internal calculations of someone who'd spent decades evaluating risk versus reward. Miss Rivera, your credentials are impressive, and your proposal addresses legitimate concerns about our competitive position. But I have to ask about timing. Why now? Why is RDC suddenly interested in partnering with Blackwood Hospitality? The question I'd been dreading and preparing for in equal measure. The moment when business strategy intersected with personal history, when the clean lines of professional competence might become complicated by the messy reality of why this opportunity had presented itself in the first place. Market conditions have created a unique window for transformation in the luxury hospitality sector, I said carefully, choosing words that were both truthful and strategically incomplete. RDC has been monitoring Blackwood's brand evolution for several months, waiting for the right moment to propose partnership. Recent competitive pressures have made that timing optimal for both organizations. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the complete truth either. The board didn't need to know that my interest in Blackwood Hospitality had begun as research into my boyfriend's family business and had evolved into something much more strategic only after his mother had made her contempt for me personally clear. Robert Fairchild studied my face with the penetrating attention of someone accustomed to detecting deception in high-stakes negotiations. And RDC's exclusivity requirements. You're asking us to commit to a partnership that would prevent us from working with other design consultants for the duration of our agreement. Exclusive partnerships produce exclusive results, I replied. RDC's value proposition is based on creating signature experiences that your competitors can't replicate. That's only possible if our creative resources are focused entirely on your success rather than divided among multiple hospitality groups. Martin Keating spoke for the first time since the introductions, his voice carrying the strain of someone who understood exactly how much pressure the board was under to make the right decision. The timeline is aggressive. Full implementation across all properties within 18 months. Can your team actually deliver on that schedule? RDC has assembled a network of craftspeople, designers, and specialty suppliers specifically for projects of this scope. We're not talking about hiring contractors and hoping for the best. We're talking about activating relationships that have been built over years of successful collaborations. Which was another way of saying that Heritage Craft Studios and its network of partner artisans would finally have the opportunity to work on the kind of large-scale project that could transform the entire industry's understanding of what authentic luxury actually looked like. Margaret Chen Williams closed her portfolio and sat back in her leather chair, her expression indicating that she'd reached some internal conclusion about the viability of what I was proposing. Miss Rivera, assuming the board decides to move forward with your pilot program, what kind of oversight would you expect from Blackwood management? Collaborative consultation on strategic decisions, regular progress reports, and final approval on major expenditures. But creative control would need to remain with RDC if you want us to deliver the results we've promised. Design by committee produces mediocre outcomes, and mediocre outcomes won't solve your competitive challenges. The silence that followed felt charged with possibility and risk in equal measure. These were people accustomed to maintaining control over every aspect of their business operations, being asked to surrender creative authority to an outside consultant they'd known for less than an hour. Thomas Morrison broke the quiet first, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd built his career on making difficult decisions quickly. I move that we proceed with the pilot program as outlined, subject to legal review of the partnership agreement and final approval from the full board. Seconded, Margaret Chen Williams said without hesitation. Robert Fairchild looked around the table, gauging the reactions of his fellow board members before nodding slowly. All in favor? 7 hands rose in unison, transforming months of careful planning into binding business reality with a simple gesture of collective commitment. Miss Rivera, congratulations. You've just become Blackwood Hospitality Group's exclusive design partner, pending contract finalization. I shook hands with each board member in turn, maintaining the professional composure that the situation required while internally savoring the moment when strategy became victory. In less than 2 hours, I'd gone from being the unsuitable girlfriend Catherine Blackwood had dismissed to being the business partner her family's survival depended upon. As Stella and I gathered our presentation materials and prepared to leave, Martin Keating approached with the careful discretion of someone who understood that sensitive conversations required privacy. Miss Rivera, there's one more thing we should discuss. Mrs. Blackwood was not present for today's meeting, but she will obviously need to be briefed on the board's decision. Given the scope of this partnership, she'll want to meet with RDC's principal consultant personally before we finalize any agreements. I had expected this moment, had actually been looking forward to it since the day I'd first conceived of this particular form of professional revenge. But now that it was actually happening, I felt a surge of anticipation so intense it was almost dizzying. Of course, when would be convenient for her? Monday morning, 10 o'clock at her private office. I should mention that Mrs. Blackwood can be quite demanding when it comes to strategic partnerships. She'll want to understand every detail of RDC's approach, your team's qualifications, and your vision for Blackwood's brand evolution. I'm looking forward to the conversation, I said, and meant every word. As Stella and I walked through the conference center lobby toward the parking garage, neither of us spoke until we were safely inside my car with the doors closed and the engine running. Then simultaneously, we both started laughing with the giddy relief of people who'd just executed the most audacious professional gamble of their careers and somehow managed to succeed. Did you see Margaret Chen Williams' face when you talked about creative control? Stella gasped between fits of laughter. She looked like someone had just told her she had to trust a toddler with her retirement fund. And Thomas Morrison trying to calculate whether we could actually deliver on that timeline. I thought he was going to pull out a calculator and start running numbers right there at the table. But even as we celebrated the immediate victory, both of us understood that the hardest part was still ahead. The board meeting had been about establishing credibility and securing commitment. Monday's conversation with Catherine Blackwood would be about something much more personal and infinitely more dangerous. She would walk into that meeting expecting to intimidate some upstart consultant into accepting her vision of how the partnership should work. Instead, she would discover that the woman she'd humiliated at her dinner table was now in a position to determine whether her family's business would survive the next 2 years. The only question was whether she would be professional enough to separate personal animosity from business necessity, or whether her pride would ultimately destroy everything her family had built. Monday morning arrived with the kind of gray drizzle that made Seattle famous and Portland melancholy, the perfect weather for a reckoning that had been 4 days in the making. I sat in my car outside the Blackwood Hospitality Group headquarters, watching the rain streak down my windshield while mentally preparing for what would either be the most professionally satisfying conversation of my career or the most spectacularly awkward encounter I'd ever voluntarily subjected myself to. Catherine's office occupied the entire top floor of a gleaming downtown tower, all glass and steel reaching toward the cloudy sky like a monument to corporate ambition. Through the lobby's floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the usual collection of expensive suits and serious expressions that marked Monday morning in the world of serious money. None of them had any idea that the woman in the sensible Honda was about to walk upstairs and fundamentally alter the power dynamics of their carefully ordered universe. My phone buzzed with a text from Stella wishing me luck, followed immediately by another message from my mother asking if I was eating enough and reminding me to call her grandmother later. The contrast between those two worlds, between the strategic complexity of what I was about to attempt and the simple human concern of family love, helped center me in a way that no amount of professional preparation could have achieved. I gathered my leather portfolio and headed across the street, my heels clicking against the wet pavement with a rhythm that felt like a drumbeat announcing the arrival of consequences Catherine Blackwood had never seen coming. The elevator ride to the executive floor gave me exactly enough time to transform from Zoe the woman into Miss Rivera, the business consultant, shifting my mental state from personal satisfaction to professional competence. Catherine might hate what she was about to discover, but she would never be able to question my qualifications or my commitment to delivering results for her company. The receptionist, a polished young woman whose smile could have powered half of downtown Portland, directed me toward Catherine's private conference room with the kind of deference reserved for people whose meetings appeared on the CEO's calendar. She had no way of knowing that this particular appointment would be unlike any other business discussion Catherine had ever experienced. I was deliberately 10 minutes early, using the time to arrange my presentation materials and position myself at the conference table in a way that would give me psychological advantage when Catherine entered. Power dynamics were established in the first 30 seconds of any important conversation, and I intended to control every variable I possibly could. Catherine swept into the room at exactly 10 o'clock, her presence commanding attention like a force of nature contained in an impeccably tailored suit. She moved with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her ability to dominate any room she entered, her silver hair perfectly styled and her jewelry chosen to remind everyone present that they were in the presence of serious wealth. She was halfway to the conference table before she looked up from the tablet she'd been studying and actually focused on my face. The moment of recognition was everything I could have hoped for and more. Catherine's expression shifted from polite professional interest to shock, then confusion, then something that might have been panic before finally settling on a mask of controlled fury that didn't quite manage to hide the fear underneath. "You," she said, the single word carrying enough venom to kill a small animal. "Mrs. Blackwood," I replied, standing to extend my hand in greeting. "Thank you for making time to discuss the partnership between Blackwood Hospitality and Rivera Design Consortium. I think you'll find our proposal addresses many of your company's current strategic challenges." She ignored my outstretched hand, moving around the conference table to take the seat that would normally have given her positional authority over any business conversation. But today, surrounded by my presentation materials and facing someone who knew exactly how much leverage she actually possessed, Catherine's usual commanding presence felt diminished rather than intimidating. "This is impossible," she said, her voice tight with the strain of trying to process implications that didn't make sense according to her understanding of how the world worked. "You're David's girlfriend. You run some little craft shop downtown. You can't possibly be the consultant my board hired." "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding," I said, settling back into my chair with the calm assurance of someone who held all the important cards. "I'm not David's girlfriend anymore. As for Heritage Craft Studios, that's just one of several business entities I manage. Rivera Design Consortium is my primary consulting firm, and we specialize in luxury hospitality transformations exactly like the one your board has committed to pursuing." Catherine's face went through several shades of pale as the full scope of her miscalculation began to register. This wasn't some coincidence or elaborate prank. This was the systematic execution of professional revenge by someone she'd underestimated so completely that she'd never even bothered to research what that person was actually capable of achieving. "The merger," she whispered, and I could see her making connections that should have been obvious days earlier. "You killed our technology merger because of what happened at dinner." I terminated a business relationship with people who had demonstrated that they didn't share my values regarding mutual respect and professional courtesy, I corrected. "Just like I'm sure you would terminate any partnership with a consultant who treated your family with contempt." She stood abruptly, pacing to the window that offered a panoramic view of downtown Portland spread out below like a map of possibilities and consequences. When she turned back toward me, her expression had shifted from shock to the kind of calculating attention she should have paid me from the very beginning. What do you want? I want to transform Blackwood Hospitality Group into the most successful luxury hospitality company in the Pacific Northwest. I want to create signature experiences that your competitors can't replicate and your guests will never forget. I want to demonstrate that authentic craftsmanship and strategic business vision can produce results that satisfy both bottom-line concerns and higher aspirations. That's not what I meant, and you know it. I opened my portfolio and removed a copy of the partnership agreement the board had approved, placing it on the conference table between us like a bridge across the chasm of personal animosity that would otherwise make any productive conversation impossible. Mrs. Blackwood, I understand that this situation is personally uncomfortable for you. But your board has made a business decision based on their assessment of what Blackwood Hospitality needs to remain competitive. My job is to deliver results that justify their confidence, regardless of any personal history we might share. Catherine returned to her seat, studying the contract with the intense focus of someone who was finally beginning to understand the true scope of the trap she'd walked into. The financial commitments, the timeline requirements, the creative control provisions that would give me authority over decisions she'd always considered her exclusive prerogative. You orchestrated this, she said, her voice carrying a mixture of grudging respect and absolute fury. The timing, the proposal, everything. You manipulated my own board into forcing me to work with you. I presented your board with a solution to problems they were already struggling with. The fact that those problems became more urgent after you insulted me publicly is simply market timing. My son will never forgive you for this. The comment hit exactly where Catherine had intended it to, striking at the part of this entire situation that actually caused me genuine pain. David had been calling and texting constantly since Friday, growing increasingly desperate as he realized that his mother's humiliation of me had triggered consequences that extended far beyond our personal relationship. Your son will have to decide whether he wants to support business decisions that benefit his family's company or personal loyalty to someone who created this situation through her own choices. I said quietly, but that's between you and him, not between you and me. Catherine read through several more pages of the partnership agreement, her expression growing more grim with each clause that demonstrated just how completely her board had committed to making this collaboration work. The penalty fees for early termination were substantial enough to threaten the company's financial stability. The timeline requirements meant that any delay or dispute would cascade into broader operational problems. Most importantly, the exclusivity provisions meant that Blackwood couldn't simply walk away and find another consultant to achieve the same results. The board specifically requested that RDC maintain creative control over all design decisions, she said, reading directly from the contract. Subject only to budget approval and safety compliance. Do you understand what you're asking me to surrender? I'm asking you to trust someone else's expertise in areas where that expertise can produce results you can't achieve on your own. The same thing you ask of your accountants, your lawyers, and your marketing consultants. This is different, and you know it. You're asking me to let the woman I publicly humiliated redesign my family's legacy properties according to her vision of what luxury hospitality should look like. For the first time since entering the room, I allowed a small smile to cross my face. Catherine was finally beginning to understand not just what had happened to her, but what was going to happen next. Mrs. Blackwood, let me be very clear about something. I don't need this partnership to be successful. RDC has more opportunities than we can currently handle, and our client waiting list extends well into next year. Your board approached us because they understand that Blackwood Hospitality Group needs what we offer more than we need what they're paying us. I leaned forward, making sure she could see the absolute conviction in my eyes. But I want this partnership to succeed, because I want to prove that exceptional results come from respecting talent regardless of its packaging. I want your properties to become showcases for what's possible when traditional luxury meets authentic craftsmanship. And yes, I want you to learn that dismissing people based on your assumptions about their background is not just morally wrong, it's strategically stupid. Catherine set down the contract and folded her hands on the conference table, studying my face with the kind of analytical attention she should have applied 3 months ago when David first brought me home for dinner. You realize this changes nothing between us personally. I still think you're wrong for my son, and I still believe this relationship will end badly for both of you. You're entitled to your opinion about David and me. But your opinions about my professional capabilities are about to be tested against measurable results, and I'm confident you'll find them more than adequate. And if I refuse to work with you, if I convince the board that this partnership was a mistake, then you'll be explaining to your shareholders why you tanked a strategic initiative that could have saved your company because you couldn't separate personal feelings from business necessity. The board has already committed to this direction, Mrs. Blackwood. The question is whether you're going to be part of the solution or part of the problem. The silence that followed lasted nearly a full minute, filled with calculations and considerations that would determine not just the future of our professional relationship but the trajectory of Catherine's entire approach to managing her family's business legacy. Finally, she picked up her pen and signed her name to the partnership agreement with the decisive strokes of someone who had decided to gamble everything on her ability to maintain control even in circumstances she'd never anticipated facing. Miss Rivera, you win this round. But understand that I'll be watching every decision you make, questioning every recommendation you propose, and holding you accountable for every promise you've committed to delivering. If you fail to meet expectations, I will personally ensure that every influential person in this industry knows exactly what kind of consultant they should avoid. Fair enough, I replied, countersigning the contract that would give me creative authority over 12 luxury properties and a budget that exceeded anything Heritage Craft Studios had ever imagined accessing. But if I succeed in exceeding expectations, I trust you'll be equally vocal about recommending RDC to other hospitality groups who might benefit from our services. Catherine stood and extended her hand for the first time since entering the room, her grip firm with the resigned determination of someone who had just committed to a partnership she never wanted with someone she would never trust. David is waiting downstairs, she said as we concluded our business. He's been calling me since Friday, begging me to fix whatever went wrong between you two. I assume you'll want to speak with him. I gathered my portfolio and headed toward the door, pausing only long enough to deliver one final thought about the choices that had brought us to this moment. Mrs. Blackwood, your son spent 2 years watching you treat me like I was beneath your family's consideration, and he never once made it clear that your behavior was unacceptable to him. Some things can't be fixed with apologies and good intentions. 3 months later, the transformation of Blackwood Hospitality Group's flagship Portland property was featured on the cover of Architectural Digest, with a 6-page spread showcasing how authentic craftsmanship could elevate traditional luxury into something approaching art. The revenue increases exceeded even our most optimistic projections, and the waiting list for reservations extended 4 months into the future. Catherine Blackwood attended the grand reopening celebration, delivering remarks that praised RDC's vision and execution without ever explicitly acknowledging that she had initially opposed the partnership. She was professional, gracious, and utterly committed to ensuring that everyone present understood her role in the property's spectacular success. David sent me a congratulations card that arrived the day after the Architectural Digest issue hit newsstands, along with a handwritten note apologizing for not understanding sooner what I was capable of achieving. He'd taken a position with a sustainable development firm in San Francisco, pursuing work that aligned with his values rather than simply inheriting his family's expectations. As for me, I stood on the terrace of the renovated Portland property that evening, looking out over the city lights while sipping champagne that probably cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. Stella found me there as the celebration wound down, joining me at the railing with her own glass, and the satisfied expression of someone who had just helped execute the most audacious professional victory of her career. "Any regrets?" she asked, gesturing toward the transformed space that bore testament to what could be accomplished when vision met opportunity. I thought about the question seriously, considering everything that had happened since that awful dinner when Catherine had pushed my handmade gift away like garbage. The partnership that had emerged from that humiliation was genuinely beneficial for everyone involved. Blackwood Hospitality was more successful than ever. RDC had established itself as the premier luxury hospitality consultant in the region. Catherine had learned that underestimating people carried real consequences. "Just one," I said finally. "I wish my father could have seen this. He always said that good work speaks louder than expensive words, and people who can't hear the difference don't deserve your time." "I think he would have been proud," Stella replied. "And I think Catherine Blackwood learned exactly what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness." 6 months later, Rivera Design Consortium received partnership proposals from 17 luxury hospitality groups across 3 countries, all of them citing the Blackwood transformation as evidence that authentic craftsmanship could deliver results that traditional approaches couldn't match.
We were booked solid for 2 years, with a waiting list that included some of the most prestigious properties in North America. Catherine and I maintained a professional relationship that was cordial, productive, and completely devoid of personal warmth. She never apologized for her behavior at that dinner, but she also never again made the mistake of assuming that people who worked with their hands lacked the intelligence to outmaneuver people who had inherited their authority. And sometimes, late at night when I was working in my studio, I would think about that wooden jewelry box I'd spent 3 weeks perfecting, the one Catherine had pushed away with such casual contempt. It was still sitting on my workbench, its delicate mechanism still playing Debussy's Clair de Lune, whenever I opened the lid. I never did give it to anyone else. Instead, it served as a reminder that the most valuable gifts we offer aren't always the ones people are ready to receive, but that doesn't make them any less worth creating. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.